Hello, I'm Bill Averis, the Content Director for the Mobile Enterprise 360 community, and I'm happy to be joined here today by Amit Pandey, who is Group Vice President of Mobile Platforms at Citrix. Amit, thank you very much for being my guest here today.
That's great, Bill. My pleasure.
I want to talk a little bit about mobile device management. Let's start with a simple question. In your mind, and for the purposes of our audience, which is IT managers, what is mobile device management?
That's great. Thank you for the easy question. Mobile device management is exactly what it sounds like. It's the ability to manage mobile devices such as tablets and phones, whether they're personal devices that employees bring, often known as BYOD, or corporate-issued devices that companies hand out to their employees. The particulars of MDM typically have to do with controlling and managing access to the corporate network, email, and increasingly now corporate data and applications.
Mm-hmm. So given the access to sensitive data, given the proliferation of devices out there, is MDM an issue for the CIO primarily, or are we targeting IT professionals, say, further down the IT food chain when we talk about MDM, or both?
It's interesting. I would say that the people who obviously implement it are IT professionals, but the concerns typically arise even, I would say, as high as the CEO of the company. There are well-publicized stories around data loss and employees forwarding emails or storing data from their mobile devices on cloud storage platforms. And so, that hits the CEO when they're reading the Wall Street Journal or New York Times, and they typically reach out to the CIO and say, what are we doing about this? So it generally can start very high up. Another very common way MDM starts is that the CEO or the CEO's staff bring in a device that's not that IT doesn't necessarily sanction, like an iPad or Android tablet, and suddenly, the CIO and the IT folks get tasked with providing email support on those devices. So there you go. Suddenly everybody's involved. But I would say MDM also concerns employees, right? Because if you're like me, you probably every now and then have left your phone somewhere and hopefully have recovered it, but sometimes not. And you get very concerned about the data that's on there. You get worried about, can people see my email? Can they see, any data that I have left on say an application like Evernote that might have, bank account numbers? Hopefully you don't do that sort of thing, but sometimes people do. And so really at that point, MDM even concerns, every employee in the company that has a phone or a tablet on which they have sensitive data.
This is a good segue into my next question. Given that there are multiple companies that essentially control the platforms and manufacture them, and then we have the operating platforms themselves that are and there are multiples of those out there. How difficult is it to put together a cogent, unified, consistent MDM strategy in an organization today?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a proliferation. As very recently, Microsoft brought out Windows Phone 8 and Windows Tablet, and before that, obviously, there was the iPhone and Android, and Blackberry is now talking about Blackberry 10, and so there is a proliferation of devices and operating systems. Android itself has over 1,000 flavors, and 20 or 30 of those are very prevalent, and so the good news though is that the top 4 or 5 MDM vendors are generally quite responsive about providing very rapid support from these vendors and these operating systems companies. So, day one or close to day one support is generally provided by the top MDM vendors. So if you are using, an MDM solution, chances are that they will simplify the complexity around all of these devices in OS.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Our own research here at IDG shows that, and I think probably because of the rapidity with which the mobile world has exploded, that really a lot of companies are just sort of beginning to embark on developing an MDM strategy. That being the case, what are some logical first steps that they can take and or perhaps should be exploring as they're putting together the elements of an MDM strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would have answered the question very differently 2 years ago when we got in, when companies really started getting into mobility and enabling mobility, throughout. Now I would say before the questions were more about, do they support all devices? Do they support all OSs? Can they, the functionality around the security itself, are access controls provided? Do they link into Active Directory well? Some of the basic questions around planning out MDM, who are you going to give access to? How deep will it be? And so on and so forth. I would say the pace of evolution has been so incredibly rapid in the last 2 years that the questions have changed. The questions now are much more about, how much enablement do you want in your enterprise when it comes to mobility, right? So, MDM is a first step for most companies. Most large enterprises we speak to now say, well, the reason we're doing MDM is not for the sake of managing the device, but because we want to roll mobility out throughout our enterprise. We want our employees to have access to, SAP apps in the data center. We want them to have access to their Microsoft apps that they use on their desktops, but now we want them to get that on a mobile device. We want them to have access to the native apps, productivity apps that they're downloading off the App Store. But we want to make sure that at the same time we secure those apps. There's so many stories about people storing financial data in cloud platforms that are not sanctioned by IT. And so, the dilemma here is really around security versus enablement. And the MDM, as you think about rolling out MDM, you have to say, well, what more do we want to do with this mobility platform? And think through the various applications and the data that you want people accessing, who you want accessing it, and at what level. So you have to really think through a broad enablement strategy as opposed to just saying, hey, what do we do to manage these devices?
Excellent advice, Amit. I mean, like you say, it really is a balancing act that has to be struck out there between access and, allowing the users to do kind of what they want to do. Amit Pandey, Group Vice President of Mobile Platforms at Citrix, thank you very much for joining me here today.
Great. My pleasure.
And I'm Bill Leveris, and thank you very much for joining us here as well.